The retirement party was my wife Clara's idea, and like all her ideas, it was executed with a kind of flawless, impersonal perfection. The garden behind our house, a space I had personally tilled and cultivated for over 30 years, was unrecognizable. It had been transformed by rented marquees, strings of fairy lights that glittered like captured stars, and cocktail tables draped in white linen. A string quartet, hired for an obscene amount of money, was playing something classical and discreet in the corner. It was all very tasteful, very elegant, and it felt about as much like me as a tuxedo on a scarecrow. I stood near the French doors, a glass of champagne I hadn't asked for fizzing in my hand. I was 65 years old. For 42 of those years, I had worked at the same engineering firm, starting as a junior draftsman and ending as the head of the structural design department. I'd built bridges, schools, and office towers. I'd poured my life into steel and concrete, into blueprints and stress calculations. I was a man of substance, of tangible things. This party, with its fleeting bubbles and polite chatter, felt like smoke. Clara drifted through the crowd, a vision in a silk dress the color of a summer sky. She was beautiful. She had always been beautiful, with a poise that made people straighten their own backs in her presence. She would touch an arm here, laugh a silvery laugh there, the perfect hostess. Our guests were a mix of my colleagues, her social circle, and the families of our neighbors. They smiled at me, shook my hand firmly, and said all the right things. Congratulations, Arthur. Enjoy the rest. You've earned it. What will you do with all that free time? I would smile back and give vague answers. I wanted to say, I'm going to finish the boat I've been building in the garage for 10 years. I wanted to say, I'm going to read all the history books that have been gathering dust on my shelves. I wanted to say, I'm going to sit in my garden, the real one, and listen to the birds without a deadline screaming in my head. But those were my truths, simple and solid, and they felt out of place here, among the canapes and the air kisses. My son, Leo, was holding court near the bar. At 35, he was a taller, sharper-featured version of his mother. He had her confidence, but on him, it often curdled into arrogance. He hadn't inherited my patience or my love for quiet, methodical work. He was in finance, a world I didn't understand, full of abstract numbers and aggressive gambles. He wore a suit that probably cost more than my first car, and he laughed a little too loudly, always conscious of who was watching. I had done everything for that boy. I worked overtime for years to afford the private school Clara insisted on. I taught him how to ride a bike, how to tie a Windsor knot, how to drive a car. I sat in the bleachers at every one of his football games, even when I was exhausted from a 70-hour work week. I had tried to build a bridge to him, but it seemed the foundations were always on shifting sand. He was his mother's son, through and through. Clara tapped a crystal glass with a spoon, the clear, high-pitched ring cutting through the murmur of conversation. The string quartet fell silent. All eyes turned to her. She stood on the small, temporary dais set up for the speeches, a radiant smile on her face. I just want to say a few words about my wonderful husband, Arthur, she began, her voice smooth and practiced. For 42 years, he has been the rock of this family, a provider, a protector. He has worked so hard for me, for our son, Leo. And now, he finally gets the rest he so richly deserves. We are all so proud of you, darling. Polite applause rippled through the garden. I felt a familiar dull ache in my chest. It was a good speech. It ticked all the boxes. But it felt like she was describing a useful piece of furniture, not the man she had shared a bed with for nearly 4 decades. She spoke of my work, my providing, but not of my heart, my dreams, my fears. She gestured towards our son. And now, I know Leo would like to say a few words. Leo sauntered up to the dais, taking the microphone from his mother. He had a smirk on his face, the kind he got when he was about to make a joke at someone else's expense. Usually, it was one of his colleagues or a rival. I braced myself. "Thanks, Mom," he said, his voice amplified, booming through the quiet garden. He looked out at the crowd, then his eyes landed on me. The smirk widened. "Everyone's been talking about my dad, Arthur, and what a great provider he's been." He paused for dramatic effect. The silence stretched. I could feel the polite smiles on the faces of my colleagues starting to stiffen. Something was wrong. The air grew thick and heavy, like before a thunderstorm. And he has been, Leo continued, his voice dripping with a strange, theatrical sincerity. He paid for the house. He paid for my education. He paid for all of this. He gestured around the manicured party. He's been a fantastic financial supporter, a great benefactor. My stomach tightened. Benefactor, financial supporter. What kind of words were these for a son to use about his father? I looked at Clara. Her smile was frozen in place, but a flicker of panic entered her eyes. She knew what was coming. She knew, and she was doing nothing to stop it. Leo took a deep breath, puffing out his chest. He looked directly at me, and his voice dropped, becoming clear and sharp as a shard of glass. But I think, on a day of such honesty and reflection, it's time for the whole truth to come out. It's something my mother and I have talked about for a long time. The garden was utterly silent now. The only sound was the faint clinking of ice in a forgotten glass. I could feel 100 pairs of eyes on me. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Arthur has been a great man in my life, Leo declared, his voice ringing with false magnanimity. But he is not my real dad. The words hung in the air, obscene and monstrous. They seemed to suck all the oxygen from the garden. I saw my boss, a man I respected immensely, flinch as if he'd been struck. I saw our neighbors, the Hendersons, exchange a look of pure shock. I saw my secretary, a kind woman who had worked with me for 20 years, cover her mouth with her hand. The humiliation was a physical force. It hit me in the chest, knocking the wind out of me. It was a hot, searing wave that washed over my skin and settled deep in my bones. My life, my 42 years of work, my identity as a husband and a father, it was all stripped away, right here, in front of everyone I knew. I was rendered a fool, a cuckold, a prop in someone else's drama. I looked at Leo. His face was triumphant, flushed with the power of his devastating revelation. He was proud of himself. Then I looked at Clara. Her face was a mask of pale, horrified shock, but her eyes, her terrified eyes, met mine for a fraction of a second. In that fleeting glance, I saw it all. It wasn't shock at the news. It was terror at the timing. It was the look of a conspirator whose partner had just gone rogue. The truth was not the bomb. The public detonation was. Something inside me, a quiet, load-bearing beam that had held me up for decades, did not break. It didn't snap. It simply vanished. And in its place, a profound, chilling clarity bloomed. The hurt was there, a vast and desolate ocean of it. But on its surface, a single, hard, diamond-bright thought formed. This is over. I didn't shout. I didn't rush the dais. I didn't cause a scene. That was their style, not mine. I was a builder. I knew that the most important work is done quietly, methodically, and with a solid plan. I straightened my back. I looked past Leo and Clara, past the stunned faces of my friends and colleagues. I looked at the garden gate at the far end of the lawn. Then I did the one thing they didn't expect, the one thing that wrestled a sliver of control back from their grand, cruel performance. I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was small, tight, and completely devoid of warmth. It was the smile of a man who has just seen the final card turned over and understands the game completely. I placed my untouched champagne flute on the tray of a passing waiter. I smoothed the front of my jacket, and without another word, without a single glance back, I turned and walked away. I walked through the crowd of stunned statues, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the grass. I walked past the string quartet, who were staring, bows frozen over their instruments. I walked to the garden gate, unlatched it, and stepped through, closing it gently behind me. I left my own retirement party, my own home, and the entire hollow structure of my life. And as I walked down the quiet suburban street, the distant, frantic sound of Clara calling my name was nothing but noise. The building was condemned. It was time to plan the demolition. The walk was aimless at first. My feet just moved, one in front of the other, carrying me away from the wreckage. The manicured lawns and tidy houses of our neighborhood blurred past. Each window I passed seemed like an eye, watching the neighborhood fool on his walk of shame. But it wasn't shame I felt. Not anymore. The initial, fiery blast of humiliation had burned itself out, leaving behind something cold and hard. It was the feeling of a surgeon looking at a diseased limb. The grief was real, but the diagnosis was clear. Amputation was the only course. My keys were in my pocket, my wallet, my phone. I had the essentials. I walked for nearly an hour, until the familiar streets gave way to the main commercial road. The evening traffic hissed by, headlights cutting through the twilight. I found myself standing in front of a sterile-looking chain hotel, all glass and beige panels. It was anonymous. Perfect. I booked a room for a week. The young woman at the desk gave me a professionally blank smile, not noticing or not caring that I had no luggage. The room was on the 3rd floor, overlooking a parking lot. It smelled of industrial cleaner and faint cigarette smoke. I locked the door, and the silence was a physical relief, like a cool cloth on a fevered brow. I sat on the edge of the stiff, corporate-patterned bedspread and finally allowed myself to breathe. The scene from the garden replayed in my mind, not as a chaotic mess of emotion, but as a piece of film I could study frame by frame. Leo's arrogant posture, the way he held the microphone like a weapon, Clara's fleeting look of panicked complicity. It wasn't a spontaneous, drunken confession. It was a planned detonation. They just hadn't expected me to walk away from the blast zone. They expected me to stand there, covered in the rubble of my life, and beg them to explain. They expected me to play the part of the wounded old man. My mind, trained for decades to see patterns and structural weaknesses, began to work. If this revelation was the endgame, what was the game? What had been the moves leading up to it? I started going back in time, not with the hazy nostalgia of a husband and father, but with the cold precision of an auditor. I thought about Leo. He had always been different, not like me. I was quiet. He was loud. I found satisfaction in creating. He found it in acquiring. I had always chalked it up to him taking after Clara. But there was more. There was a distance in him that I could never cross. When he was a boy, I'd tried to teach him woodworking in my garage workshop. He'd been impatient, bored, complaining about the sawdust. He had no interest in how things were made, only in having them. Then there were the small cruelties. I remembered his 16th birthday. I had spent months in the garage restoring a vintage motorcycle for him, a classic 1970s Triumph. I'd rebuilt the engine myself, piece by piece. When I unveiled it, he'd looked at it with a sneer. "It's old," he'd said. "Why couldn't I just get a new one?" Clara had rushed in to smooth it over. "Oh, Arthur, you know how teenagers are. He just wants what his friends have. It's a lovely thought, though." She had called my love, my labor, a thought. I sold the bike a week later and put the money in his college fund. He never asked where it went. The pattern began to emerge, woven through the years. My contributions were always minimized, my value always translated into a dollar amount. My time, my effort, my love, they were treated as a service I was obligated to provide. Clara was the master of this subtle devaluation. "Don't bother Arthur with that, dear. He's tired from work." "Your father doesn't understand these things, Leo. Let's you and I decide." She had built a wall between me and my son, brick by quiet, dismissive brick, and I had been too busy, too tired, too trusting to see it. She had isolated me from my own family, too. My sister Mary had never liked Clara. "She looks at you like you're a stepping stone, Arthur," she'd told me once, years ago, after a tense Christmas dinner. Clara had overheard. The fight that followed was epic. Clara accused Mary of being jealous, of trying to ruin our happiness. She made me choose. And I, wanting peace in my own home, had chosen my wife. My correspondence with Mary dwindled to polite Christmas cards. Clara had cut me off from anyone who might have offered an objective perspective. The finances, that was the next piece. I had always been the primary earner, but Clara managed the household accounts. She was organized, meticulous. I trusted her completely. "You focus on your work, darling," she'd always say. "I'll handle the rest." And I had. I'd handed over my paycheck every month, content that the bills were paid and our future was secure. But there were inconsistencies, now that I let myself see them. The time she claimed we needed a new roof, a massive, unexpected expense. Yet, I never saw a roofing truck, and the shingles always looked the same to me. When I asked, she'd waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, they came while you were on that business trip to Chicago. It's all done." There was the investment opportunity her brother, a slick, unsuccessful man named Richard, had presented. I had been hesitant, but Clara had been insistent. "It's for Leo's future, Arthur. We can't afford to be timid." I signed the papers. The investment, predictably, vanished without a trace. Richard declared bankruptcy a year later. Clara had sighed and said, "Well, we tried." It was all there. A 40-year history of being managed, handled, and monetized. I wasn't a husband. I was an income stream. I wasn't a father. I was a provider of services. The love I thought was the foundation of my life was just a facade, a beautifully decorated set for a play in which I was the unwitting fool. And Leo. Leo was the weapon they had been sharpening all this time. Why now? Why at my retirement party? The timing was everything. My career was over. My earning potential was gone. The asset, me, had matured. It was time for liquidation. They probably assumed that in the face of such a profound public and private humiliation, I would crumble. I would be a broken, guilt-ridden old man, grateful for whatever scraps of affection they chose to throw my way. I would sign over the house, my pension, my savings, just to maintain the illusion of a family, just to not die alone. Leo's parentage was the key. By revealing I wasn't his biological father, they were attempting to sever any moral or emotional claim I had on the wealth I had built. I was just the benefactor. And now that my services were no longer required, it was time for me to pay my severance and disappear. The coldness in the hotel room began to seep into my bones, but it was a clarifying cold. My grief was immense. The life I had believed in was a lie. The woman I had loved had betrayed me in the most fundamental way imaginable. The boy I had raised as my own saw me as a bank account. The loss was incalculable. But beneath the grief, the engineer in me was taking over. A structure had failed. It had failed due to hidden defects, fraudulent materials, and a fundamentally dishonest design. The only thing to do now was to conduct a thorough analysis of the collapse, document the reasons for the failure, and then begin the methodical process of clearing the site. I took out my phone. The screen lit up with dozens of missed calls and frantic texts from Clara. I ignored them. I opened a web browser. My first search was for top divorce lawyers specializing in financial forensics. My second was for private DNA testing kit. The decision was made. They had planned their attack for years. They thought they were delivering the final killing blow. They had no idea I was the kind of man who always read the blueprints, and I was just beginning to draw up my own. The quiet man they had underestimated for 40 years was about to start building something new, a case, and it would be constructed with the same methodical, unbreakable precision as every bridge I had ever designed. The next morning, I woke up with a stiff back and a clear head. The emotional storm of the previous night had passed, leaving a landscape of stark, unadorned reality. I ordered a coffee from room service and sat by the window, watching the morning commuters fight for parking spots. They were all on their way to work, to their lives. Mine had been demolished. Now it was time to sift through the rubble. My first call was not to a lawyer. It was to my sister. I hadn't spoken to Mary in person in almost 5 years. Our relationship had been reduced to a sterile exchange of holiday cards, a casualty of Clara's campaign of isolation. I found her number in my contacts, and my thumb hovered over the screen. A wave of shame washed over me. I had let Clara push her away. I had chosen my manipulative wife over my own blood. I pressed the call button before I could lose my nerve. It rang 3 times, and then her voice, older, a little raspier, but still unmistakably Mary, came on the line. "Arthur," she sounded surprised, cautious. "Mary, it's me." My own voice was thick. "I know who it is," she said. There was a pause. "Is everything all right? It's not even Christmas?" A hint of her old, dry wit. "No," I said, the word coming out heavier than I intended. "Nothing is all right." And I told her. I told her everything. The party, the guests, Clara's polished speech, and then Leo's brutal announcement. I spoke in a flat, monotone voice, narrating the events like a witness giving a statement. I left out my own emotions, focusing on the facts. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. I thought she might have hung up. That witch, Mary finally hissed, her voice shaking with a fury that was startlingly fierce. I knew it. I always knew there was something rotten about her, and that boy… Arthur, I am so sorry. So sorry. Tears pricked my eyes. It was the first real, untainted sympathy I had received. It was a lifeline. I should have listened to you, Mary, I whispered. No, she said, her voice firm. No looking back like that. You were in love. You built a life. You thought you were doing the right thing. This isn't on you. This is on her. So, what are you doing now? Where are you? A hotel, I said. I left. I just walked out. Good, she said, a note of approval in her voice. That's the first smart thing you've done in a while, little brother. Now for the second. You're going to pack your things, check out of that sad little hotel, and you're going to come stay with me. My spare room is empty, and I make a much better pot of coffee than any room service. I hesitated. It felt like an imposition. Mary, I don't know. Arthur, don't you dare argue with me, she cut in. You are not going through this alone. You let her isolate you for decades. That's over. I'm your family. Now, give me the address. I'm coming to get you. An hour later, Mary's sensible sedan pulled up to the hotel entrance. Seeing her get out of the car was like stepping back in time. She was grayer, more lines around her eyes, but she had the same determined set to her jaw, the same intelligent, no-nonsense eyes. She hugged me, a real hug, strong and solid, and for a moment I just sagged against her, the full weight of my 65 years pressing down on me. Come on, she said, patting my back. Let's get you home. Mary's house was a small, cozy bungalow 2 towns over, filled with books, plants, and the smell of baking bread. It was a home, not a showroom. She set me up in the guest room, which looked out onto her own chaotic, beautiful garden. It was a sanctuary. That afternoon, as we sat at her kitchen table, I laid out my suspicions. The financial irregularities, the isolation, the timing of the announcement. Mary listened, her expression growing darker with every word. She wasn't just cheating, Arthur, Mary said, tapping a finger on the table. This is a long con, a 40-year con. They were waiting for you to retire. When the money tap was turned off, they planned to take the whole reservoir, the house, the pension, everything. Leo's paternity is their moral justification. They're going to paint you as the outsider, the man who was generously allowed to fund their lives, and now his time is up. It was brutal to hear it said so plainly, but it was also validating. I wasn't going crazy. The pattern was real. So, what's the plan? She asked, her gaze sharp. First, proof, I said. I need to know for sure about Leo. I had already ordered the DNA kit online. It was being delivered to a post office box I had opened that morning. I needed a sample from Leo, which was a problem. Then I remembered something. Years ago, when Leo was in college, he'd been obsessed with his dental health. He'd left behind a box of his things in the attic, including his old electric toothbrush. The heads were interchangeable. He'd almost certainly left an old one in there. It was a long shot, but it was a start. As for my own sample, that was easy. Second, a lawyer, I continued. Not just any lawyer, someone who can handle a messy divorce with financial fraud. Mary nodded, already pulling out her laptop. I know someone who might be able to help. My friend Carol went through a nasty divorce a few years ago. Her ex was hiding assets offshore. Her lawyer was a shark. Young, but brilliant. Let me get his name. The name was Benjamin Carter, a partner in a small, aggressive firm in the city. I looked him up. The website described him as specializing in complex marital asset division and forensic accounting. He was exactly what I needed. I scheduled a consultation for the following week. The third step was the hardest. I had to go back to the house. I needed documents. Bank statements, tax returns, deeds. And I needed that toothbrush head. I had to do it when I knew Clara and Leo would be out. Clara has a charity luncheon every Wednesday, I told Mary. She's always gone from 11 until at least 3. Leo will be at work. It's risky, Mary said, her brow furrowed with worry. What if she comes back early? It's a risk I have to take, I said. Everything I have is in that house. Not just the money, my whole life's work. I'm not walking away with nothing but the clothes on my back. The next few days were a strange limbo. I helped Mary in her garden. the familiar feel of soil under my fingernails, a comfort. We talked for hours, catching up on years of lost time. I told her about my work, the bridges I was proudest of. She told me about her travels, her book club, her grandchildren. It was a painful reminder of how much Clara had stolen from me. Not just a wife's fidelity, but a brother's bond. My phone continued to buzz with messages from Clara. They had progressed from frantic, "Arthur, where are you? Please come home," to angry, "How dare you just walk out and humiliate me like that?" And finally to pleading, "I miss you. We can talk this through. Please, darling, I love you." There was one from Leo, a single arrogant text. "Running away isn't going to solve anything. Mom is a mess. You need to come back and sort this out." Sort this out. The audacity was breathtaking. They detonated a bomb in the middle of my life and were now annoyed that I wasn't tidying up the debris to their satisfaction. I didn't reply to any of them. My silence was my new shield and my only weapon for now. On Wednesday, I drove my car, which had been parked on a side street near the hotel, to my own neighborhood. I parked a block away and watched. At 11:15, Clara's pristine luxury sedan pulled out of the driveway. She was wearing a wide-brimmed hat and sunglasses. The Queen was on her way to court. My heart hammered as I walked up the driveway. My own house felt like enemy territory. The key still worked. The silence inside was unnerving. The house was immaculate, of course, not a cushion out of place. It looked like a magazine photo and felt just as cold. I went straight to my office. The filing cabinet was where I kept all our important documents. I started pulling files, tax returns for the last 20 years, mortgage documents, bank statements, my pension portfolio, the deed to the house. I shoved them into a duffel bag I'd brought. Then the attic. The pull-down stairs groaned in protest. The air upstairs was hot and smelled of dust and old memories. I found the box marked Leo College in a corner. Inside, beneath old textbooks and a faded football jersey, was the electric toothbrush base and a small case of spare heads. I took one, sealed it in a plastic bag I'd brought, and put it in my pocket. It felt like stealing a piece of my own life back. As I was about to leave, a small, lacquered wooden box on Clara's dressing table caught my eye. It was a jewelry box I had given her for our 10th anniversary. I had never seen her use it for jewelry. I had always assumed she kept sentimental trinkets in it. On a gut instinct, I opened it. Inside, there were no trinkets. There was a small, neat stack of papers, tied with a silk ribbon. It was a bank passbook, for an account I had never heard of, at a bank we didn't use. The account was in her name only. My hands shook as I opened it. The first entry was dated 36 years ago, just after Leo was born, a deposit of $5,000. The entries continued, sporadically at first, then more regularly. There were large deposits that corresponded almost exactly with the dates of the new roof I'd paid for and the failed investment with her brother Richard. Over the years, the transfers had become more frequent, smaller amounts siphoned from the household account she managed. The current balance, printed in neat dot matrix font on the last page, made me gasp. It was over $500,000. But it was the name on the account that stopped my heart. It was a joint account. Clara Montgomery and Richard Montgomery. Her brother, the slick, bankrupt brother. And then I saw it. Tucked into the back of the passbook was another document, a folded, yellowing piece of paper. It was a copy of a birth certificate, Leo's birth certificate. My name was listed under father, but written in faint pencil in the margin, in what I recognized as Clara's elegant handwriting, was another name, a man's name I had never heard before, and next to it, a date. The date was 6 weeks after I had left for a 2-month-long project in South America, a year before Leo was born. This was it. The critical discovery. The blueprint of the entire 40-year lie. It wasn't just infidelity. It was a calculated long-term financial fraud, with her brother as her accomplice. They had been bleeding me dry for my entire married life. Leo wasn't just the product of an affair. He was the excuse, the cover story, the emotional leverage they used to justify their theft. A rage, cold and pure, unlike anything I had ever felt, settled over me. It wasn't the hot, explosive anger of a betrayed husband. It was the focused, icy fury of a man who has discovered a fundamental flaw in the load-bearing structure of his world, a flaw deliberately created. I took the passbook and the birth certificate. I put them in the duffel bag with the other documents. I walked out of the house, my house, and didn't look back. The game had changed. This was no longer just about a painful divorce. This was about justice. This was about reclaiming not just my money, but my life, from the people who had treated it as their personal property. My resolve, which had been hardening all week, was now forged into steel. The consultation with Benjamin Carter was in a sleek, modern office building that smelled of success and expensive coffee. The man himself was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with a sharp suit and an even sharper gaze. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He gestured for me to sit, and his eyes were already scanning me, assessing, calculating. "Mr. Thorne," he began, his voice crisp. "Your sister gave me a brief overview. I understand you've had a difficult week." "You could say that," I said, my voice dry. I placed the heavy duffel bag on the floor next to my chair. "Tell me everything," Carter said, leaning forward, all business. "Start from the beginning. Don't leave anything out, no matter how small or embarrassing it seems. The details are where we win." For the next 2 hours, I talked. I recounted the retirement party, the 40 years of my marriage, the financial inconsistencies, my sister's warnings, the trip to the house, and the discovery of the secret bank account and the annotated birth certificate. I spoke with the dispassionate clarity of an engineer detailing a structural failure. Carter didn't interrupt. He just listened, his pen scratching occasionally on a legal pad. His expression was unreadable. When I finally finished, I felt drained, hollowed out. I reached into the duffel bag and placed the bank passbook and the folded birth certificate on his polished desk. Carter picked up the passbook first. He flipped through it, his eyes narrowing. He spent a long time looking at the names on the account and the pattern of deposits. Then he picked up the birth certificate. He studied the paper, the official print, and the faint pencil scribbles in the margin. He looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw something other than professional detachment in his eyes. It was a spark of righteous indignation. "Mr. Thorne," he said slowly, "this isn't a divorce case. This is a prosecution." A wave of relief washed over me. He saw it. He understood. "What your wife and her brother have been engaged in," he continued, his voice hardening, "appears to be a systematic, long-term conspiracy to commit fraud. They have used your marriage as a vehicle for embezzlement. The money for the roof, the investment with her brother, it all went directly into this hidden account. They were laundering your own money and stealing it from you under the guise of household expenses." "And Leo?" I asked, the name tasting like ash in my mouth. "Leo is the leverage," Carter said, tapping the birth certificate. "His parentage is the emotional blackmail they intended to use to make you compliant after your retirement. The announcement at the party was a strategic move, a public declaration of your diminished status in the family. They wanted to humiliate you into submission. They assumed you'd be so broken by the news that you wouldn't have the will to fight for the assets." He leaned back in his chair. "Their arrogance is their weakness. They believe they hold all the cards. They have no idea you've been to the house. They have no idea we have this." He gestured to the passbook. "They think you're licking your wounds in some motel, waiting to crawl back. This gives us the element of complete surprise." "So what do we do?" I asked. "We gather our ammunition, silently," Carter said, a predatory gleam in his eye. "First, the DNA. You have the sample from your son?" "His old toothbrush head," I confirmed. "Good, and yours. We'll get that processed by a reputable lab, chain of custody maintained. That will be Exhibit A. It legally demolishes your paternal obligation, which is a cornerstone of their narrative. Next," he went on, "we'll subpoena the full records for this secret account. The passbook is the key that unlocks the door. We'll get every transaction, every withdrawal, every transfer since its inception. We'll also subpoena her brother's financial records. I'd be willing to bet we find a direct correlation between his declared bankruptcy and a large withdrawal from this account." "I also need you to do something difficult," Carter said, his gaze steady. "I need you to compile a list, a detailed list of every major expense you can remember that seems suspicious. The roof, the investment, any large cash withdrawals Clara explained away. Dates, amounts, anything you can recall. We'll cross-reference it with the bank records. We're not just showing they stole. We're showing exactly how they did it, lie by lie." The work was painstaking. I spent days at Mary's kitchen table, poring over the bank statements I had taken from the house, my old notebooks, and my own memory. Each lie I uncovered was like pulling a thorn from my soul. The $5,000 emergency dental surgery for Leo that never happened. The $10,000 for a landscaping project that was just a few new rose bushes. The $20,000 to help her mother with medical bills when her mother had been covered by excellent insurance. It was a tapestry of deceit, woven over decades. Meanwhile, Ben Carter was a whirlwind of quiet, lethal activity. He hired a forensic accountant, a woman named Ms. Albright, who was, in his words, a bloodhound with a calculator. They worked in the background, filing motions, issuing subpoenas, and assembling a mountain of evidence. And all the while, I maintained complete silence. Clara's texts eventually stopped. A week after I met with Carter, a stiff, formal letter arrived at Mary's house, forwarded from my old address. It was from Clara's lawyer. It was a proposed divorce settlement. It was breathtaking in its audacity. She was offering me my pension, what was legally mine and she couldn't touch anyway, and a small percentage of my own savings. In exchange, I was to sign over the house, all its contents, and waive any claim to her personal assets. The letter stated that given the recent painful revelations about Leo's paternity, this was a generous offer designed to allow us both to move on with dignity. They were framing my cuckoldry as a debt I owed them. I forwarded the letter to Carter. His emailed response was a single sentence. Let them think they're in control. Their overconfidence is our greatest asset. The DNA results came back 2 weeks later. Carter called me. It's official, Arthur, he said, his voice matter of fact. 0% probability. You are not his biological father. I expected to feel something, sadness, anger, maybe even relief. But I felt nothing. It was just a fact, a data point confirming the structural failure. The emotional amputation had already happened. Leo was a stranger I had raised, a tenant who had lived in my house for 35 years. Ms. Albright, the forensic accountant, delivered her report a week after that. It was a thick, spiral-bound document that detailed with chilling precision 40 years of financial malfeasance. She had cross-referenced my list of suspicious expenses with the secret account's records. It was a perfect match. She had also uncovered something more. Clara and her brother, Richard, had used the embezzled funds to set up a small real estate holding company. They owned 3 rental properties, all purchased with my money, all generating a steady income that went directly to them. The total amount they had stolen, including the value of the properties, was just over $1.2 million. Carter called me into his office to review the report. We have them, Arthur, he said, his voice calm, but his eyes blazing. This is airtight. We have the motive, the means, and a 40-year paper trail. The fraud charges alone could send them both to prison. What's our next move? I asked, my own heart beginning to beat a little faster. The methodical planning phase was over. It was time to act. We arrange a meeting, Carter said, a slow smile spreading across his face. We'll respond to their lawyer's generous offer. We'll say you're ready to discuss the terms. We will invite them here, to this office, to finalize the agreement. You, me, your wife, her son, and her lawyer. And just for good measure, we'll invite her brother Richard as well, under the pretext of him being a witness to the family's financial arrangements. A trap, I said. A controlled demolition, Carter corrected me. They are expecting a broken old man to sign away his life. They are going to walk into a courtroom. He looked at me, his expression serious. You have to be prepared for this, Arthur. It's going to be brutal. They will lash out. They will say terrible things. You cannot react. You must be the calm at the center of the storm you are about to create. You are the engineer. You just present the data. Let the structure collapse on its own. I thought of the years of quiet humiliation, the dismissed comments, the condescending pats on the arm. I thought of the man I had been, the man who absorbed it all for the sake of a peace that was never real. That man was gone. I'm ready, I said, and my voice did not shake. The day of the meeting was gray and overcast, the sky the color of wet concrete. It suited my mood. I had slept soundly, the deep, dreamless sleep of a man with a clear purpose. I put on my best suit, a conservative navy blue one I'd bought for a conference years ago. It was a suit that projected quiet authority. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a stranger looking back. The tired, accommodating man I had been was gone. In his place was someone older, yes, but his eyes were clear and his back was straight. I met Ben Carter in the lobby of his building. He gave me a single, firm nod. "Ready, Arthur?" "Let's get this done," I said. The conference room was at the end of a long hall. It was designed to be imposing. A long, dark mahogany table reflected the recessed lighting overhead. At one end were a pitcher of water and several glasses. At the other, a large screen was mounted on the wall, currently blank. Carter had me sit on one side of the table, an empty chair beside me. He sat at the head, his files arranged neatly in front of him. We waited. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the calm before the controlled explosion. At precisely 10 o'clock, the door opened. Clara's lawyer, a portly man named Franklin, entered first. He had a look of smug satisfaction on his face. He was followed by Clara herself. She was dressed in a severe black suit, her hair pulled back tightly. She looked pale but composed, the grieving, wronged wife. She refused to look at me, her gaze fixed on a point on the far wall. Then came Leo. He swaggered in, a smirk playing on his lips. He looked me directly in the eye, a clear challenge. He thought he had won. He thought I was here to surrender. He sat beside his mother, leaning back in his chair with an air of casual ownership. Finally, Richard, Clara's brother, scurried in. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around the room. He was a small, weaselly man who looked like he was perpetually trying to escape his own skin. He took a seat next to Leo, avoiding my gaze entirely. Franklin cleared his throat, arranging his papers. "Well," he began, his voice booming with false cordiality, "I'm glad we could all come together to resolve this unfortunate matter amicably. My client, Mrs. Thorne, is prepared to be reasonable, as outlined in our proposal. We're here today to get the necessary signatures so everyone can move on." Carter let the silence hang in the air for a moment before he spoke. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but carried an edge of steel. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Franklin, and thank you, Clara, Leo, Richard, for joining us. However, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. We are not here to sign your proposal. In fact, we find it to be insulting." Franklin's jovial mask slipped. "Insulting? It's a perfectly generous offer under the circumstances." Clara finally looked at me, her eyes filled with a cold fury. "After what he put me through, humiliating me by walking out of that party, he's lucky to get anything." Leo chimed in, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look, Arthur, let's just cut the drama. You did your part, you provided. We're grateful. But the family situation has evolved. Sign the papers. Take your pension. Go build your little boat and enjoy your retirement. It's the least you can do after 40 years of living a lie." I didn't say a word. I just looked at him. I held his gaze until he was the one who had to look away, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. I followed Carter's instructions. I was the calm. Carter smiled, a thin, dangerous smile. "Living a lie? That's an interesting choice of words, Leo. Let's talk about lies, shall we?" He picked up a remote, and the screen on the wall flickered to life. The first image that appeared was a high-resolution scan of Leo's birth certificate. "We'll start with this," Carter said. "Leo Thorne, born October 12th. Father, Arthur Thorne. A legal document. A lie." He clicked the remote. The next image was a close-up of the pencil scribbles in the margin, the other man's name and the date. "A little note from your mother, Leo. A clue to the truth." Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Her eyes darted from the screen to me, full of venom. "You went through my things? How dare you?" "And then," Carter continued, ignoring her, "there's this." He clicked again. The official report from the DNA lab filled the screen. The damning heading was visible to everyone. Probability of paternity, 0%. Leo stared at the screen, his smug expression finally faltering. He looked confused, like a child who had just been told a fairy tale isn't real. Franklin, the lawyer, was shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "So, we've established the foundational lie," Carter said conversationally. "Arthur is not your father, Leo. So the narrative you and your mother have constructed, the one where Arthur owes you a comfortable life out of guilt for his biological irrelevance, it falls apart, doesn't it? He owes you nothing. In fact, one could argue that after funding your entire existence for 35 years under false pretenses, you owe him. He let that sink in. The air in the room was thick with tension. But this was never really about paternity, was it? Carter went on, his voice dropping. That was just the cover story, the emotional leverage. The real story is about this. He clicked the remote again. A new document appeared on the screen. It was the cover page of Ms. Albright's Forensic Accounting Report. Title, Forensic Analysis of Financial Accounts for Clara and Richard Montgomery. Richard made a small, choked sound. His face had gone the color of old parchment. Over the past few weeks, Carter explained, we have conducted a thorough audit of the Thorne family finances, or what Mr. Thorne believed were the family finances. What we discovered was a second parallel financial life, a secret. Click. A scan of the passbook for the secret joint account appeared. An account opened by Clara and her brother Richard 36 years ago, Carter narrated, an account my client had no knowledge of. Click. The next slide was a flowchart. On one side was a box labeled Arthur Thorne's Income. Arrows led from it to boxes labeled Household Account. From there, smaller arrows siphoned off funds to the secret account. The dates and amounts were listed. $10,000, new roof, May 1998. $25,000, Richard's investment, March 2005. $5,000, emergency dental, September 2011. It was my list. My life of lies, diagrammed in cold, hard graphics. Clara was staring at the screen, her composure finally shattering. This is absurd. It's illegal. You can't just steal my private bank records. We can with a subpoena, Clara, Carter said calmly, and we did. And what they show is a clear, undeniable pattern of embezzlement and fraud stretching back 4 decades. Click. The next slide showed the financials for the real estate holding company, the properties purchased with my money, the rental income they had been collecting for years. And this is where the money went, Carter said. Not just siphoned off, but invested. You didn't just steal from Arthur. You built a secret empire with his life's work. He turned to the final slide. It was a single number, glowing in the center of the screen in a large, bold font. $1,245,782.31. That is the conservative estimate of the amount you and your brother have stolen from Arthur Thorne, adjusted for inflation, Carter said, his voice like the snap of a whip. That is the number we are here to discuss today. Silence. A profound, echoing silence fell in the room. It was the moment after the blast, when the dust is still hanging in the air and the full extent of the devastation becomes clear. Franklin, the lawyer, was pale. He was looking at his client not with sympathy, but with the horror of a man who has just realized he's been brought in to defend a bank robber caught with the money bags in hand. Leo was utterly still, his face a mask of disbelief. The world he had taken for granted, the wealth he had assumed was his birthright, was all built on a crime. His mother wasn't a wronged woman. She was a thief. Richard was sweating profusely, his eyes wide with pure terror. He looked like a cornered rat. And Clara. Her face had crumbled. The mask of aristocratic poise was gone, replaced by a contorted visage of pure, cornered panic. She looked at the number on the screen, then at me. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The power in the room had not just shifted. It had reversed polarity with the force of a lightning strike. The smug, confident predators who had walked in were now the trembling, exposed prey. I remained silent, just as Carter had instructed. I watched them. I watched the edifice of their arrogance and deceit collapse in on itself, brought down by the simple, brutal weight of the truth. It was a terrible sight, and it was the most profoundly satisfying moment of my entire life. Clara found her voice first. It was not the smooth, melodious voice she used in public. It was a raw, ragged shriek. "Lies! It's all lies!" she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "He's twisting everything. That money was mine. It was for my security. He was always so controlling with money." Carter let out a short, sharp laugh, devoid of any humor. Controlling. Clara, he gave you his entire paycheck every month for 40 years. He trusted you implicitly. Your security was a slush fund for you and your brother, built on the back of his labor. The courts will not see that as security. They will see it as grand larceny. My brother had nothing to do with this, she cried, trying to shield Richard, who looked like he was about to faint. Richard's name is on the joint account, Carter stated flatly. Richard's failed business ventures were funded by this account. Richard is a co-owner of the holding company. He's not an innocent bystander, Clara. He's your co-conspirator. The district attorney's office will be very interested in his role. At the mention of the district attorney, a new level of terror entered the room. Franklin, Clara's lawyer, threw his hands up in a gesture of surrender. Clara, I strongly advise you to stop talking, he said, his voice strained. We are in a very, very precarious position here. Leo finally spoke, his voice a choked whisper. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at his mother. Is this true, Mom? Is it true? The foundation of his world had been pulverized, and he was desperately trying to find solid ground. He made me do it, Clara sobbed, her lies becoming more frantic and desperate. He was cold. He was distant. I was lonely. I needed something that was mine. I had remained silent through it all, a statue of calm amidst their chaos. But this final pathetic attempt to paint me as the villain who drove her to a life of crime, this I could not let stand. I finally spoke. My voice was quiet, but it cut through her hysterics like a scalpel. You were lonely, Clara? I asked, my gaze level. I was the one who was lonely. I was lonely at every parent-teacher conference you were too busy to attend. I was lonely at every holiday dinner where you and your family spoke to me like I was the hired help. I was lonely in a marriage where my only value was the number on my paycheck. I turned my attention to Leo. His eyes were wide, fixed on me. You think I was just a benefactor, Leo? I was the man who held you when you had a fever. I was the one who taught you to throw a baseball. I built you a treehouse with my own 2 hands. I was your father. In every way that mattered, I was your father. The fact that we don't share DNA doesn't change the life I gave you. It just exposes the lie you and your mother chose to build your lives on. My voice remained steady, filled not with anger, but with a profound, weary sadness. This was never about the money. Not really. The money is just a number. This is about my life. The 40 years of it, you treated like a resource to be plundered. You didn't just steal my savings, Clara. You stole my trust. You stole my past. You stole the very idea of my family. I stood up. Mr. Carter has our terms. They are not negotiable. Carter slid a new document across the table toward Franklin. Here is our settlement proposal, he said. It's quite simple. Mr. Thorne will get the house. He will get 100% of his pension and savings. He will also receive a payment of $1.25 million, representing the stolen funds and the assets of the holding company. You have 1 week to liquidate the properties and transfer the funds. If you fail to comply, this entire file, he patted the thick binder of evidence, goes directly to the police and the DA. We will pursue criminal charges for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy, and we will sue you in civil court for punitive damages. Clara stared at me, her face a mess of tears and disbelief. The Queen had been checkmated. Arthur, you can't, she whispered, her voice pleading now. You'll leave me with nothing. I am leaving you with exactly what you left me with, Clara, I said, my voice cold. The truth. Richard suddenly pushed his chair back and scrambled for the door, muttering, I need some air. Carter didn't stop him. Leo buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. The arrogant prince had been reduced to a broken man, discovering in the space of an hour that his entire identity was a fraud. I looked at Clara one last time. The beautiful, poised woman I had married was gone. In her place was a desperate, grasping stranger. There was no love left, no anger, just a vast, empty space where a life used to be. This meeting is over, I said quietly. I turned and walked toward the door, not looking back. Ben Carter fell into step beside me. As I reached the door, Clara called out my name, one last, desperate cry. Arthur, please. I paused, my hand on the doorknob, but I did not turn around. I thought about what to say. A final, cutting remark? A declaration of my victory? No, that was their way. My way was quieter. I simply opened the door and walked out, closing it firmly behind me, shutting them in with the wreckage they had created. The hallway outside the conference room was silent. Ben Carter and I walked toward the elevators without speaking. When we reached them, he pressed the down button. The little light glowed. He turned to me, a small, respectful smile on his face. You were perfect, Arthur. You were the rock. They shattered themselves against you. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 40 years. My legs suddenly felt weak. I leaned against the wall. The adrenaline that had been coursing through me was draining away, leaving behind a profound exhaustion and a sense of dizzying emptiness. The battle was won. The war was over. But the field was littered with the ghosts of my life. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Now, we wait, Carter said. Franklin is a practical man. He knows he has no case. He'll advise them to take the deal. It's financial ruin for them, but it's better than prison. They'll sign. It might take them the full week to swallow their pride, but they'll sign. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. We stepped inside. As the doors closed, I saw my reflection in the polished steel. I looked pale, older than I had that morning, but my eyes were my own. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living in my own skin, not in a costume somebody else had designed for me. The week that followed was agonizingly slow. I stayed with Mary, who treated me with a gentle, unspoken understanding. She didn't ask for details. She just made sure there was always a hot pot of coffee and that the house was filled with the quiet bustle of her life. I spent hours in her garden, weeding, pruning, my hands in the soil. It was grounding. It was real. I received one phone call. It was from an unknown number. I answered it cautiously. It was Leo. His voice was unrecognizable. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, broken tone. I just wanted to say, he stammered, I'm sorry. I had no idea about any of it. The money, all of it. She always told me. She said you were distant, that you didn't really want me. And you believed her, I said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. I was a fool, he said, his voice cracking. I was an arrogant, entitled fool. You were a good dad. You were my dad. And I threw it all away for nothing. For a lie. He started to sob, deep, racking sobs. I listened for a moment. I felt a flicker of something, a ghost of the paternal love I had once had for him. But it was like feeling a phantom limb. The connection had been severed too cleanly, too brutally. Goodbye, Leo, I said softly, and I ended the call. There was nothing more to say. His apology was for him, not for me. He had to live with what he had done. I had to build a life out of what was left. On the 6th day, Carter called. They signed, he said. The transfer is initiated. The house is yours. It's over, Arthur. Relief was not the explosion I had expected. It was a quiet tide, slowly washing away the tension in my shoulders, the knot in my stomach. It was the simple absence of a great weight. The consequences for them were swift and severe. Clara and Richard had to sell their rental properties at a loss to make the payment. Clara had to sell her car and her jewelry. They were left with practically nothing. She moved into a small, bleak apartment above a laundromat, paid for by her brother, who had managed to avoid charges by cooperating fully, but was now socially and financially radioactive. Their circle of friends, the ones who had witnessed my humiliation, quickly abandoned them when the truth of their epic fraud became common gossip. There is no greater sin in those circles than being poor and disgraced. Clara tried to contact me one last time. She showed up at the house after I had moved back in. I saw her through the window, standing on the porch, looking thin and lost. I didn't answer the door. I just watched until she finally gave up and walked away, a ghost haunting the ruins of a life she had torched with her own hands. The house felt strange at first. It was full of memories, most of them now tainted. For the first month, I systematically purged it. I packed up all of Clara's clothes, her perfumes, her books, and donated them. I boxed up all of Leo's old things, the football trophies, the graduation photos, and put them in the garage. I hired painters and had the entire interior of the house painted in new, clean colors. I sold the ornate, uncomfortable furniture Clara had picked out and bought simple, solid, comfortable pieces that I liked. Slowly, the house began to feel like mine. I spent my days in my workshop, the smell of sawdust and oil a balm to my soul. The boat I had been building for a decade began to take shape. Its frame was strong, its lines were true. It was something I was building for myself, with no one else's expectations to meet. 6 months after the meeting in Carter's office, I was sitting on my back porch. The garden was no longer the perfectly manicured, soulless space it had been for the party. I had torn out the fussy, ornamental plants and put in a large vegetable patch. The fairy lights were gone, replaced by the simple glow of the evening sun. My sister Mary was sitting across from me. We had spent the afternoon harvesting tomatoes. Our relationship, once a casualty of Clara's war, was now the cornerstone of my new life. "You seem lighter," she said, sipping her iced tea. I considered that. "I feel like I've been living in a house with a cracked foundation for 40 years, I replied. I was always trying to patch the walls, ignore the creaks, pretending it was solid. Now the house is gone. I'm living in a tent, maybe, but I'm on solid ground." She smiled. "It's a pretty nice tent." I looked out at my garden, at the boat taking shape in my garage, at the comfortable, quiet home I had reclaimed. It was more than a tent. It was the beginning of a new structure, one I was building to my own specifications. My journey had started with a profound humiliation, a public stripping of my identity. I was the fool, the victim, the benefactor whose time was up. But they had made a critical error. They had underestimated me. They saw a quiet, compliant man, and they mistook my patience for weakness. They didn't understand that a man who builds bridges for a living knows that the most important strength is on the inside, in the hidden framework that holds everything up. When they tried to demolish me, they found that my foundation was made of something they couldn't comprehend: self-respect. It had been buried deep, but it was still there. And once I decided to reclaim it, I became unbreakable. My name is Arthur Thorne, and this was my story. It's a story about betrayal, yes, but it's not a tragedy. It's a story about the quiet, unglamorous, and deeply satisfying work of reclamation. It's about the truth that family is not about blood, but about trust and respect. And it's about the simple, powerful fact that it is never, ever too late to tear down a life built on lies and build a new one, a true one, in its place. You just have to be willing to pick up the tools and do the work.